Brian Kemple of Continuum Philosophical Insight. Today we're going to take 15 minutes to talk about masculinity. If you want to know more about me, who I am, and the work I do, there are some links below that will point you in the right direction. So unless you've been living under a rock, which seems perhaps an enviable place to live these days, I should not need to point out that masculinity has been a controversial topic over the past few years. Now, I could argue against the various claims that have been made against something like a quote-unquote traditional concept of masculinity or the accusations of toxicity, but I would rather not stick my toes into that cesspool. Rather, I want to talk simply about what masculinity is, without any sort of qualifying adjectives. So to do this, let's start by asking, what do we typically mean by the word masculine? It's an adjective derived from the Latin masculus, meaning male, and we often transform this concrete descriptor into an abstract noun. That is, we use masculine to describe individuals, but we talk about masculinity as an object in its own right. That is, an object in the sense outlined in another 15-minute insight, which is included in the links below. Clearly, such an abstract object is not a thing in itself. You can't go out and poke masculinity in the ribs or slap it in the face, no matter how much some people would seemingly love to, because it is not something which exists apart from the individuals in which it exists. And yet, at the same time, this object does not reduce to any or even all of those individuals. In other words, there's something signified by the word masculinity that is over and above any masculine individuals, and this object, so signified, is, I would say, a pattern of possibilities, which is only ever partially realized in actuality in any and all individuals. Or we could maybe say that there are infinite degrees of possible masculinity, though not infinite ways in which one can be masculine. For this pattern of possibilities has an essential configuration, and without that essential configuration, no matter how many other realizations of the pattern one manifests, one cannot be masculine. So naturally, we need therefore to identify the essential configuration of the pattern of masculinity. Because of recent post-gender ideology, many defenders of the idea of masculinity have focused on the biological aspect. That is, the distinctive male physiology, which of course is very important. But I think there is a trap in thinking exclusively or primarily about masculinity from nothing other than the biological perspective. Namely, that this leads to a reductionism. That is, if we look for the cause of the distinction of masculine from feminine, solely in terms of genes and hormones, we are missing the bigger picture, and often implicitly accept a reductionistic and materialistic causal framework. So yes, testosterone is important in the distinction. So is the SRY protein, so is the Y chromosome. But no quantity of testosterone makes a male human being masculine in the fully humanly meaningful sense. While someone cannot truly be masculine without these biological components, that is, we can describe a woman as being rather masculine in the sense that she possesses many incidental traits of masculinity, but she is not and cannot be essentially masculine. While we can't be truly masculine without these biological components, the requisite biology alone does not make someone masculine. Or to put this in Aristotelian Thomistic causal terms, the form of masculinity, which is a property of the substantial form of being human, requires in any individual that it possess a certain kind of matter, just as the form of humanity requires in any individual that there be bones and flesh and so on, to use Aquinas' example. Any masculine individual must have the Y chromosome and testosterone, from which there will be further consequences enabling the actions befitting a masculine individual, such as greater muscle growth relative to women, male genitalia, a neurochemical tendency towards responding to situations with aggressiveness, and so on. But the form of humanity is irreducible to having flesh and bones and organs in the correct disposition and proportion. And so too is the form of masculinity irreducible to having testosterone and muscles and man parts in the correct disposition and proportion. That is, the form of humanity consists principally in certain operations, most especially those concerned with virtuous exercise of the faculties which are distinctive to being human, those faculties of the intellect and will, which faculties redound to and thereby elevate the faculties which we share in common with other animals. As a quick aside and a quick plug, this complex dynamism of faculties is something into which I plan to delve in the upcoming Thomistic Psychology seminar. But returning to the discussion, the form of masculinity, as differentiated from femininity, does not produce distinct faculties in the human being, and so does not produce distinct operations. It does, however, modulate the faculties, and therefore modifies the right or fitting way for a man to perform certain operations, as opposed to the right way for a woman to perform certain operations. In other words, depending upon one's biological sex, as the material disposition required by the form of either masculinity or femininity, there are different fitting patterns of operation, and it's these fitting patterns which we call, generally speaking, gender. There is something incomplete, I would posit, about someone with masculine biology who does not conduct himself within the fitting patterns of masculine gender, and likewise someone having feminine biology who does not conduct herself within the fitting patterns of feminine gender. Now, foregoing any discussion of the feminine, how do we determine whether or not the pattern of one's operations is fitting to the masculine form? If our only criterion is whether or not the operations seem enabled by the biological, we will again miss the point. We need to look beyond the formal and material in itselfness of the individual, in other words. And I think we need, therefore, to look also at three further kinds of causes. First is the objective or specifying cause. Now, this is a kind of causality unfamiliar to most people. It's not found in the traditional Aristotelian taxonomy, but is a development of later scholasticism, which remained buried to most thinkers for centuries afterwards. If you have my Introduction to Philosophical Principles book, I do go into more detail about it there. But to give a succinct presentation, the objective or specifying cause is an extrinsic formal cause, one which determines our cognitive and cathectic faculties by presenting to us objects in specific and specifying ways. This cause differs for men and women insofar as their faculties, as aforementioned, are modulated by the respective masculine and feminine forms. That is, nothing is different on the part of the object, but something is different on the part of the recipient. That such a difference occurs has been demonstrated by a number of studies showing, for instance, different toy preferences in very young children. That is, male children tend towards a certain kind of toy and female children tend towards a different kind, before there could be really deep instillment of cultural preference, in other words. So there's something biological in this dispositioning towards specific sorts of objects. So, male and female are not differently determined by all objects, right? Or in all ways, but in many and perhaps most they likely are. Especially if they have grown up and maintained for years a kind of environment which is fitting to those respective forms. That is, a girl brought up in the company of boys will likely develop more tomboyish attributes and be more alike to boys in the way she is determined by objects, whereas a boy brought up in the company of girls will likely develop more typically feminine interests and responses. Moreover, the media to which a mind is regularly attuned will have similar consequences. The excess of fantasy universe media attention, for instance, tends to distort our conceptualization insofar as it distorts our habits of image creation. But that's a topic for the forthcoming third Literature and Philosophy 15-minute insight, whenever I happen to get around to that. Regardless, the point I am attempting to convey here is that the objects to which we direct our minds, and by which our minds are conversely directed, are both influenced by and influential over the patterning of our gender, either in ways which are fitting to our forms or ways which are unfitting. Now, that's not to go too far, I think. A girl may enjoy watching sports without losing her femininity, and a boy may feel great empathy for animals or children without losing his masculinity. But I think a girl who wishes to be very muscular and strong does lose something of her femininity, and a boy who wishes to be lithe and demure seems to lose something of his masculinity. And this brings us to the second kind of cause which we cannot afford to hear or overlook, the internal final cause. That is, every living individual has, by virtue of the essential form making it to be the kind of thing that it is, a determinate end or goal through which that living organism attains its perfection. Often this internal final cause results in a series of concatenated relative final causes, as someone seeking happiness seeks a spouse, and seeking a spouse seeks to make himself attractive, and seeking to make himself attractive dresses nicely and works out, and so on and so forth. Since happiness, in the Aristotelian eudaimonic sense, is the final cause of all human beings, our question here is, how is this pursuit of happiness modulated by the form of masculinity? Now, this is a question which every man must contemplate for himself, for it is an ethical question, and ethical questions, while they may be understood from and interpreted through some universal laws, ethical questions always require particular resolutions. That is, the masculine modulation of virtue will be slightly different for every human individual male, but there are certain commonalities. The virtue of courage, for instance, as specifically male, skews far closer to recklessness than caution than it does for women, for the most part. But I think a specific modulation by sex and gender, which has often been overlooked, regards the virtue of prudence. The virtue of prudence is the virtue of right reasoning concerning things to be done, that is, actions to be taken. Now, you might get in a huff and say, how can right reasoning be distinctively male or female? Isn't reasoning common to both men and women? Are you saying that men are more reasonable than women? To answer these questions in reverse, no, men are not more reasonable than women. Yes, reasoning is common to both, but it is distinctively male or female insofar as being formally differentiated. We very typically, with rare exception, grow up being habituated to reason in different ways. Not that we see different intellectual truths, but we do form different phantasms, different perceptual percepts, right? Insofar as we are differently specified by the objects, as mentioned above. That is, men's reasoning concerning things to be done is often focused on attaining results, on implementing plans on who can do what, how, when, and where, while women's reasoning concerning things to be done more often focuses upon the persons involved, how they might or will be affected, how well they are treated, and so on. That's not to say women can't be good planners or that men can't be empathetic. Rather, we're looking at typical and malleable patterns. But there is a good reason that these patterns tend to follow the way that they do. In other words, the biological foundations, the formal foundations of each sex tends to conduce to these typical patterns, and each conduces to the other as complementary attributes. That is, each completes the other in some way. If all we had was the planning of men, then people would be trod over quite regularly, and if all we had was the consideration of women, then, well, we might not be as efficient or productive, because we're spending too much time thinking about how this will affect people. So this complementarity leads us into the last of our causes to consider, the external final cause. We are, each of us, parts of a whole greater than any one of us. While there is a unique dignity to the human individual which makes each, as a comprehender of the universe in some sense, greater than all the material whole, we are nonetheless each still subordinate to a common good. And this ties into so many things, many more than I could reasonably talk about here. Being a good husband, a good father, a good leader in the community when called upon to do so, a good follower of other leaders when it is those others' talents that are called upon, and so on. But I suppose in sum, masculinity primarily consists in understanding yourself and how you as a man are related to the things around you. This self-understanding seems hard for many to grasp today. We live in an age dominated by illusions, where media deeply infects our minds with habits of fantasy which are found hard to shake, and where the promise of technological mastery suggests that we may realize in our physical reality these fantasies. Perhaps we may, and in gaining the whole of our desire, we would lose our souls. But to return for just a moment to the notion of understanding yourself as a man, I think this is something that is not well practiced today. By this I mean that we come up readily with excuses or justifications for behaviors which are not fitting to what it means to be a man. And so to take just one example, let's think for a moment about physical fitness. There's something very fitting, I think, about men seeking some sort of physical strength. I'm not saying that men need to go out and be able to bench press, 350 pounds or whatever, but there's something fitting to our biology and to our complementarity to women that we be physically strong. And yet you find a lot of men are not actually pursuing that, either because they don't go work out, they don't exercise, or if they do exercise, their pursuit is a vain appearance and not actual functional strength. And it's easy to justify, right? Because you say, oh, well, I look good. I have the look of how a man is supposed to look, even though, I can barely move any weight and I have no real functional strength. And so this is the kind of reflection that I think we need to make. If we think about this in terms of causes, simply looking good, right, is not really a fulfillment of that individual internal final cause, nor is it contributory towards some sort of external final cause. So, as always, thank you for listening, entertaining what I have to say, subscribing, perhaps donating to my Patreon, or thinking about signing up for my Lyceum. And I hope you have found this worth hearing. So, until next time.